But today, I'm going to get to speak out of Exodus chapter 3. And what we're going to see here is the start of something really cool for a really cool character in the Bible. The primary character in the Bible, the person that we learn from and through the most here in Exodus, is this guy named Moses. And as you're going to learn over the next month or so as we study through this book of Exodus, is that Moses is a big deal. He's the real deal. He's kind of a legend. If you've been in the scriptures for a long time, you know that Moses is he's the dude. And if you haven't read it yet, you're going to learn that he's the dude, right? Like Moses has this epic legacy. He was the guy who split the Red Sea with his staff. He's the guy who spoke to God face to face and brought us the law. Moses is the guy who went toe to toe with Pharaoh and looked him right in the eyes. You know, Moses is a big deal. He's a legend. And, you know, I love hearing stories about people like that. Epic characters who have done epic things. But sometimes when I'm in the scriptures and reading about people like that, you know, sometimes it can be discouraging because, I'm just a regular old bloke, you know? Just like the rest of us here in the sanctuary. Like I'm not some legend like Moses splitting the Red Sea, right? I haven't done that, at least this year, I haven't split no Red Seas or delivered entire people groups, right? I'm just a normal dude. I got a kid and a wife, and I go to work just like the rest of us. Sometimes characters like that seem sort of unobtainable. Do you ever feel that way? It's like, that person's cool, but I can't quite be like them. What's so interesting about Moses is all of those things that we know about Moses, all of these epic, legendary, super dope things that he's done. Did you know that all of that happened after he turned 80 years old? All the stuff that we know about Moses happened after he turned 80, which is really interesting because that means there was a lot of stuff that Moses experienced and went through before he turned 80, before he did all the epic things. When I think about Moses' life, it really kind of is broken down in my opinion, or kind of in the way that I read it, into really 4 different phases. First, you have Moses, the son of no one. When Moses was born, his life was threatened, and so his mom gave him up, put him in a basket, put him down the Nile River in order to keep him safe. So it was in this moment that Moses really was an orphan. That's kind of how his identity started. Moses, the son of no one. And Moses floats down this river. His mom, in great faith to save him, gives him away. Moses, the son of no one. And it's a really epic story, and Carrie taught really well on that last week. And then Moses ends up getting picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. She sees Moses in this basket. She picks him up and brings him into the family. And Moses gets adopted into the family of Pharaoh, which is really the second movement of Moses' life. Moses, the son of Pharaoh. Now, let's think about this a little bit. Moses gets adopted into this family, and he starts living the royal life. He starts living in this environment of Pharaoh. He's living a life of privilege and wealth. He has good food and good comfort. And there's this great leader in the household. Pharaoh's daughter is the one who picked Moses up. So Moses really looked at Pharaoh like a father figure, like a great leader. You could imagine the degree to which Moses would have looked up to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a father figure to Moses. And just to think about the life Moses was living, it was a good life. And it really wouldn't surprise me, if I was Moses, if I was to be honest, living in this circumstance, his story could have ended in that moment. Why would you try to rock the boat? Why would you try to live extensive wealth? Why would you try to leave extensive wealth? Why would you try to leave extreme comfort? He was living the good life. And I know I like to be comfortable and safe. You know, Moses was in a family of power. He really could have stayed there, and we might not have known much about Moses after that. Then Moses turned about 20 to 25 years old, and he started to get a little bit curious. He was wondering about his family of origin. He was wondering where he came from. He was wondering, who are my people? Moses knew that he was adopted. Moses knew that the people he was living his life with as part of Pharaoh's family and inner circle, he knew that there was people outside of that, right? So the dude got curious. Who's my people? What is the life they live? And so he started to explore a little bit. He started to go around and look around and see, okay, what is life like outside of this life that I've been living? And what Moses found out turned his world upside down. It deeply broke his heart. What Moses ended up seeing that it was his people, they were being oppressed. That his people were slaves, that they were being oppressed, that they were not in a good situation. And not only were the people that Moses was identifying with, Moses' people, not only were they being oppressed, but they were being oppressed by the very person that he perceived to be his father, by the very person he looked up to. So you could imagine the betrayal that Moses felt in this moment. To think, okay, like this person that brought me in when I was an orphan, I was supposed to be killed. And I'm in this family with this wealth and protection. My life is good. And it's actually the very family that I love and feel safe by. They're the one that's oppressing my people. Could you imagine how heartbreaking that is? Could you imagine the guilt that Moses felt? He should have been those people. Moses should have been out there building bricks and working as a slave, but instead Moses lived the privileged life. Moses lived a comfortable life. If that was me, I would have felt incredibly guilty. I should have been out there with them. And so Moses, inside of him, he just knows this isn't right. And so inside of him starts swelling a heart for justice, a justice for his people. And as he's exploring around and as he's interacting with his folks, he ends up seeing an Egyptian man being beaten up. And an anger rises up in him. And he kills the oppressor that was beating up the Egyptian, murders him in cold blood. Now, I think Moses had a righteous heart. He had compassion on his people. He had compassion on the Egyptian man, but he obviously went about it in the wrong way. He killed a man in cold blood. Now, Moses went about his day, and he thought he got away with it. Little did Moses know that word got around town and that some people knew what Moses did. He buried the dude, thought he covered up the evidence, but people in town knew. So Moses had to dip. He had to get out of town. He had to go into exile because if he wanted to keep his life, you can't keep your life as a murderer in those times. So then Moses leaves. He goes into the wilderness. He gets out of town and he starts working as a nomadic shepherd. He starts taking care of these flocks. He's a shepherd out in the wilderness. He ends up working for this homie named Jethro. And Jethro had a daughter. Moses married Jethro's daughter, and he starts working in the wilderness. So this is the third movement of Moses' life, the son-in-law of Jethro. And this is where Moses worked for the next roughly 50 years of his life. In this moment, Moses was in a literal wilderness. He was far away from town, far away from everything he knew. But I'd like to suggest that Moses was also in a spiritual wilderness in this moment. Everything that Moses thought his life was going to be wasn't happening anymore. You could imagine being a young person growing up with privilege and power, having all the food you wanted, comfort, these types of things, and thinking that's what your life is going to be like for the rest of your life. But he went from a palace and now he's sleeping in a tent eating bread and Lord knows what other else. He's not eating the good food that he would have grown up with. He's not experiencing the comforts of the life he grew up with. The person he thought was going to be a loving father, the person who he thought was supposed to take care of him turned out to be a scumbag. His heart's broken. He feels betrayed. His people still aren't free. 50 years later, when he first realized his people were being oppressed, still 50 years later, all he's doing is putzing around in the wilderness, and his people still aren't free. You can imagine how broken his spirit felt. I can imagine his spirit was deeply broken in this moment. Have you ever been there? Where you thought your life was going to look this way, but it turned out to look that way. Have you ever been there when you thought you were going to do the right thing? You thought you were helping somebody, but you actually ended up harming them and harming yourself. Some of us in here are in what's called a codependent relationship, where you think you're helping somebody, you think they're helping you, you think you're in a good place, but you're actually harming both of you because you're setting bad boundaries, right? We learn a lot about that in recovery around here. You see, Moses, I think, was in this place. He was in this spiritual wilderness. It would make sense to me if Moses was like, it's probably time to give up. I'm going to give up on my spirituality, my destiny to free my people. That's probably long gone. But what Moses didn't know is that while he felt like it was time to give up, he was about to wake up. That Moses in this moment was about to wake up to the divine. He was about to wake up to the presence of God. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place upon which you are standing is holy ground. You see, it's here in the wilderness that we witness the beginning of the story for Moses. You see, Moses' story didn't end when he was the son of no one. Moses' story didn't end when he was the son of Pharaoh and that turned out to be poor. Moses' story didn't end when he was the son-in-law of Jethro working a crummy job in the wilderness. No, my friends, Moses' story began when he had an interaction with God. Moses' story began when he got face to face with God. That's where the story started. And this is the fourth movement of Moses' life. Moses, a son of God. You see, it's here in the wilderness of the soul. What Moses was experiencing is most often when our soul is ready to expand and experience the presence of God. You see, so much of our life, my friends, is spent trying to protect ourselves. We become professionals at building up shells and scabs and barriers to protect ourselves. We all have various wounds in our life, things that we've experienced, things that have disappointed us, people who have disappointed us. And oftentimes where these wounds are rooted in is places where we don't feel loved. Moses started as an orphan. You could imagine the feelings of abandonment he may have felt. I'm not lovely, I'm not worth it. Somebody wanted to kill me. My birth mother had to give me up. You could imagine the wounds that Moses would have felt, realizing that Pharaoh was not a good person and that his people were oppressed, the guilt. Man, the person that loved me really doesn't love my people. How broken he could have been. And we all have wounds like that. And so what we've all done is we've spent significant amounts of our time building up identities to protect ourselves from the places where we feel unlovely, from the places where we don't feel beloved anymore. For me, in full transparency, like my mom grew up really sick. And I lived in a perpetual fear that she would die someday and leave. And so rooted in me is a major fear of abandonment. That I, throughout courses of my life, and it still comes up today, I am not perfect. That I still sometimes have fear of abandonment. And then when my mom did pass away, then I really had to come to grips with what does that mean? And then how does that relate with my interaction with God? But in the times that I felt abandoned, I built up things that would tell me I'm loved to replace the places where I felt like I wasn't. And so this resulted in various addictions. This resulted in a false sense of self. And these could look like so many things. These could look like addiction. This could look like toxic relationships. This could look like an obsession with politics, an obsession with a particular theology and group of people. We become so obsessed that our identity becomes a thing that can distract us from the places where we don't feel loved or we feel abandoned. And what happens is when we work so hard to convince ourselves that we're loved, we use television or addiction or a love of various things. We develop various idols. We become so consumed with those things that we become blind to the burning bushes that are all around us. I'd like to suggest today that there are many burning bushes all around us, that God is near and he's trying to get your attention, that he wants you to turn to him and see him. I'd like to suggest today that maybe Moses saw the burning bush this time because he was in the wilderness for so long. I don't think this is the first time God tried to get the attention of Moses. This happened to be the first time that Moses was able to see. And I think it's because he was in the wilderness. You see, what happens when we're in the wilderness is we begin to shed the things that aren't very helpful. Could you imagine trying to live in the wilderness? I can remember going on a backpacking trip. My dad was a youth pastor, and we were on this backpacking trip, and this one girl was just struggling. She was half a mile behind us, just taking one step. And then finally, she couldn't make it no more. We still were a few miles away from camp. So finally we said, we're never gonna make it if we don't help this girl out, right? So we start unpacking her bag. And we find a fan. She was literally carrying an electric fan this big. And then she was carrying a battery to make the fan go. She thought this was gonna help her be comfortable in the wilderness. But what she learned in the wilderness was that she was carrying something that wasn't very helpful. Does that make sense? When we're in the wilderness, what happens is God begins to strip away the things that we use to protect ourselves. God begins to strip away our addictions, our false identities, our identities that's tied to politics, our identities that's tied to various, our addictions that distract us from the places of pain. God begins to strip those away. Now, sometimes the wilderness comes to us, like it did to Moses. You can also enter into the wilderness by choice. Jesus went into the wilderness for 40 days, and he spent time learning. He was tempted by the devil those 40 days in the wilderness. And what we saw was that Jesus learned and experienced God in new ways. The various temptations were being stripped away while he was in the wilderness. I believe it is when we can have an authentic and intimate interaction with God that our lives can open up to the legendary work of God. You see, what Moses saw was that he was no longer an orphan. He was no longer a son of Pharaoh. He saw that he was no longer the son-in-law of Jethro. The wilderness stripped away all of those scabs, and Moses was able to see that he was a son of God. And it's only when we can live out of this identity as sons and daughters of God that we can fully step into everything that God has called us to be. You see, Moses wanted to deliver his people. He had a heart for justice. But early on, his identity wasn't in who he was face to face with God, and so he went about it in the wrong way. He went and murdered a guy. But it was after, when Moses saw that I am a son of God, a beloved son of God, that the process began for the deliverance of the people. You see, the heart Moses had for the deliverance of his people had existed the whole time since he was 20 years old. But it was once he began to taste his identity, I am a beloved son of God, that his true destiny began to manifest. Does that make sense? Because here's the truth, is when we are standing in our belovedness, we have nothing to fear. We have nothing to lose. We have nothing to gain. We have nothing to prove. We are simply God's beloved. And that identity means we don't have to place our identity in anything else. And so you may be sitting here saying like, I have a destiny that I want to fulfill. There's a person that I want to be, but I can't quite get there. It might be time to shed some of the things that is hindering you from knowing your belovedness. You might be in the wilderness and you might feel like you're about to dry up. Your lips are dry. Your cheeks are chapped. You've got a sunburn and you are so thirsty. And what I'd like to suggest is that your soul is expanding and now it's maybe time to turn and look at the burning bush. A really interesting thing to note in this scripture is that it says, when Moses turned, then God spoke. It was just a little bit of curiosity. It was Moses' willingness to just take a small step. It was his willingness just to turn our head and see, is God there? So you might be experiencing some pain. Maybe you just need to turn your head and say, is God there? You might be going through some pain somewhere else. You know, you might be struggling with your spouse or your kids. Maybe you just need to turn your head and say, is God there? Where is God in this? And then when you're in that place, yes, you say, God, where's my identity here? Who am I? Am I an orphan? Am I the son-in-law of somebody else? Am I in the lineage of an evil empire, Pharaoh? Or am I a son and a daughter of God? And when you're standing in that belovedness, that's when you can begin to stand in the fullness of who you are. And so may it be, my friends, that today we can stand in our belovedness, that we can shed the things that are distracting us from who God has made to be, and that we'd be willing to step into the wilderness and shed everything that tells us we're not beloved. Because you are beloved, my brethren. You are deeply loved by your God. And so, Jesus, I ask that you would just show the people here in this holy moment the places where they don't feel beloved. The places where they may have the identity as an orphan. The places where they may have an identity as the son-in-law of Jethro. Where they have the identity as someone who's abandoned, someone who's forgotten. Somebody in here feels as if they're not worth it, that their life isn't important. God, I pray that you would reveal those false wounds, those scabs, those shells that people have to them right now. God, would you bring up the ways in which people, this tribe, are trying to hide themselves from the pain that's deep, the addictions, the obsession with a television show or a sports team, their obsession with their job. Some people are so deep in their identity and what they do for work that they haven't seen their own belovedness yet. God, bring that up for the people. And God, I pray that you would take these people into the wilderness, that they would see these scabs, they would see the places where their eyes are blind. God, the places where the places that's hindering them from seeing the burning bush that's right next to them. God, I pray that they would be able to shed those things, that they would be able to enter into a season like Moses did in the wilderness, and they would begin to abandon the false identities that have been consuming them, and that, God, they would turn their head to the burning bush, and that God would say, Moses, Moses, there you are. I've been waiting for you. And God, may it be that the people today would realize that God knows my name. That God knows my name. He didn't call Moses orphan, orphan. He said, Moses, Moses. And let that be the place that we can live out of. a fullness in our identity, a fullness as a child of God, knowing that with God we don't lack anything. There's nothing to prove anymore. We don't have to impress our in-laws. We don't have to impress our parents. We don't have to impress the pastor. God is impressed with you. God loves you. He's obsessed with you. You no longer have to spend your life trying to impress somebody else. Maybe you're trying to impress God. He said, I already know your name. I already know you. You don't got to impress me no more. Just look into the bush. Be curious as to where I am. And he's going to say your name. And that's the place that we can live out of. So God, may it be that we know our belovedness. And that we can shed all lies that tell us otherwise. If you have anything to shed, maybe it's a lie that your dad told you. Maybe it's a trauma that you experienced. Maybe it's something that you read or believe about yourself. Today would be a great time to shed that thing. You know, the cross is a really good place to shed things, to let things die, if you will. A couple weeks ago, we celebrated a place where there was death, and then there was resurrection, there was new life afterwards. Perhaps there's a lie that needs to die, a false identity that needs to be sacrificed at the cross so that you can go there, let it die, and then leave in new life. Here at the sanctuary, we truly believe that the things you do with your body is a representation of what's happening in your heart. So I would encourage you here in a moment to maybe stand up and go to the cross and let that false identity go. Maybe through communion, which is a very similar symbolism, you can meet God there and enter into the death and resurrection through communion. Maybe you need to just get on your knees. I'll be over here. There'll be people in the back for prayer. But no longer do we need to live out of the false identities that just aren't true. Friends and family, you are the beloved children of God. And let that be where we live for the rest of our days. Amen.
Thanks for tuning in to a message from the Sanctuary Church. For more information and media, go to our website at thesanctuarywestside.org or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube.